We got up to Mishnah Dalet last time, so I want to go through into the next few Mishnayot. See how far we get today. Mishnah Dalet, Hatinokot, Ein ma'aninotan b'yom tov. Actually, I'm sorry. I want to switch this. Okay. Hatinokot ein ma'aninotan b'yom kippurim. So, tinokot here mean basically children, not necessarily infants, but kids who are underage. We do not afflict them on Yom Kippur. Ein ma'aninotan. Again, it's this word inui, which is taken from the pasuk to anu et nafshotechem. So, children, we don't afflict them on Yom Kippur. Aba mechanfinotam lifnei shana v'lifnei shnatayim. We educate them, or we prepare them before a year and before 2 years. Bishvil shiyu regilim b'mitzvot, in order that they will be accustomed with mitzvot. Okay, so let's talk about this a little bit. So what does this mean? Hatinokot ein ma'aninotan b'yom tov. So what does it mean that we don't afflict children on Yom Tov?
We afflict our children year round.
Yeah.
No, it means that we don't obligate them to fast and observe the other austerities on Yom Kippur.
Right. Presumably, this is what it means, that we don't obligate them to do it. But what does it say? So we educate them, or we prepare them before 1 year and before 2 years. What does that mean, before 1 year? What does that mean, that line? What do you think that means?
Maybe that we introduce them to, for example, fasting for part of a day a couple years before the bar mitzvah.
Right. Well, so it means something like that. So a couple of things. So you would be correct to say that the tinokot would be the time before the child is of the age of mitzvot, either bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, and so they're not obligated. So to begin with, the Mishnah is stating the obvious, in the sense that anybody who's not obligated to do inuyim on Yom Kippur is not obligated. They're by definition patur. So the language, though, what does the language imply? Ein ma'aninotan. The language could have been different. It could have said Ein tinokot mit'anin b'yom kippurim. But it says we don't afflict them. We don't afflict them here, meaning what? Meaning apparently to make them follow the afflictions, like you both are saying. So what does that say about the we? Who are the we, and what are they doing or not doing?
To go back one step, I'm assuming that we don't say that the children, I'm assuming we say that children don't afflict themselves because we assume that children do not have the necessary moral agency.
That's a big leap to give the reason, but
hypothesis.
no, I know. But the thing, wait, before you go on. So the thing is this. So apparently, the assumption is that the children don't afflict themselves. The simple reason is simply because, like I said a moment ago, why? Because they're not chayav to afflict themselves. It's not a question of moral agency or not moral agency. Question at its base. Now you can interpret this idea of Gil Mitzvot, the age of Mitzvot, and what that implies, and what implies before, and what implies after. And it will depend on the specific area of halacha that you're talking about. But before you get into that, the simplest reason is this reason that the Tinokot don't follow the Iluyim on Yom Kippur because they're not obligated to. But again, so now what was I'm sorry, I was like a long interruption, but did you want to continue? Did you want to say more?
You were asking why does it say that we don't afflict children, or that they don't afflict children? I'm assuming the subject would be probably parents, or responsible adults. Parents, maybe teachers.
Okay.
So it means that parents, teachers, what have you, don't obligate their children to take on the affliction.
Right. So why would it be phrased that way and not simply say, like we see in other Mishnayot, that Ktanim are pturim from such and such a mitzvah? Why doesn't it just say Hatinokot pturim me'inuyim b'yom kippurim? What does it imply by saying ein ma'aninotam, that we, or like you say, responsible adults, would either be parents or beit din, do not make them do the afflictions on Yom Kippur? Why is it phrased like that and not just that
maybe,
yeah? I
mean, this may be a bit of a leap, but maybe it's saying that, if those who obligate children to take on the afflictions are actually over on a negative mitzvah.
I see what you're saying. In other words, it's like it's forbidden. It's like saying it's forbidden to do that. I want to tell you, in the reading, that's a possible reading, and I wouldn't deny that. I think, and it also might even be true in the conclusion. We haven't gotten that far, but let's pay attention to what follows. So it says, "Ein ma'aninotam Yom Kippurim, aval mechanchinotam." But we do educate / prepare them, get them ready before 1 year and before 2 years. So Michael Schwartz said, maybe that means that beginning earlier than the time of Gil Mitzvot, that they do some aspect of the Inuyim. Maybe they fast for part of the day. Maybe they even fast for the whole day. And that's Mishum. And what's the point? It's Mishum Chinuch. So Ein Ma'aninotam would seem to imply that we don't. So again, it puts the parents or the responsible adult in kind of a position of power. So why doesn't it just say that the children are patur? I think because it says in this next part of the Mishnah, b'machanchin. In other words, even though the child is patur, they'll be patur all the way up until the time that they are b'nei mitzvah. But we as parents have an obligation to educate them. So the reason that the beginning of the Mishnah is phrased in that way, ein ma'anin, right, that we don't afflict them, is because of the next part of the Mishnah. That is, we do mechanech otam. We don't force them, or we don't make them to do all of the inuyim, but we as parents, in other words, so that's the point. The point is that you might think that the whole halacha is only pertinent to the person who's going to either be fasting. We'll use fasting as the catch-all for all the inuyim. You might think that it's pertinent only to the person who will be fasting or not fasting. But what we find out is it's not pertinent only to that person, in this case, the child. It's also going to be pertinent to the parent, because the parent has an obligation to educate the child. So that's what it introduces in this language. Hatinokot ein ma'aninotan b'yom kippurim. We, or the parents, or Beit Din, whoever is responsible for the child, doesn't make them do the afflictions on Yom Kippur, aval mechanchinotan, but they do educate them. So there is an obligation of chinuch, of education, which falls upon the parent, and it falls upon the parent to teach the child all of the mitzvot. But you don't teach the child all of the mitzvot all at once. You're going to educate them as is appropriate. And one second, I'll just show you another example of this, which we have not done, but you may have learned yourselves. Okay, let me share this screen. I think when we go back more deeply in the Mishnah, we'll look at this and some other things as well. Hold on one second. So here's an interesting example. It's the first mission, Chagiga. Hakol chayavim bere'iyah chutz mecherish shoteh v'katan v'tzumtzum v'androginos v'nashim v'avadim she'inam meshuchrarim. So everyone is obligated in the mitzvah of re'iyah, which is the mitzvah of showing up at the Beit HaMikdash and bringing korban on Yom Tov, on the regalim. That's the mitzvah of Riyah. Yera'eh kol zechurcha. Everyone is obligated, but then it gives a list of people who are in fact are tatsur. So you have the deaf mute, the not the shoteh, person who is not sane, katan, child. Now here it uses the term katan, and not tinoket, which may be significant. We'll talk about that in a second. And the tumtum and the androgynos, tumtum is a person whose genitalia are covered. We don't know if they're male or female. Androgynous is someone whose would be a true hermaphrodite who displays both male and female genitalia. And women and slaves that have not been released. And it goes on, but I'm just going to say Ezehu. So the Mishnah here says Ezehu Katan. So who is it? Who is a Katan? In other words, who is a Katan for the purposes of this mitzvah that they are patur? Kol she'eino yachol lirkov al ktefav shel aviv ve'alot miYerushalayim lahar habayit divrei Beit Shammai. Katan is anybody who cannot ride on their father's shoulders and go up from Jerusalem to the Temple Mount, according to Beit Shammai. In other words, if he's not old enough to do that, then he's patur. But if he's old enough to sit on his father's shoulders and walk with him for a while, right, from Jerusalem, from the city, just the city of Jerusalem, onto the Temple Mount, then he would be obligated. Beit Hillel אומרים, כל שאינו יכול לאחוז בידו של אביו ולעלות לירושלים הר הבית, שנאמר שלוש רגלים. So Beit Hillel says, no, it has to be anyone who is not yet able to hold onto his father's hands and go up to Jerusalem, from Jerusalem to the Temple Mount. As it says, the three regalim. So, what's the difference between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel?
Age, but it's really capability.
It's actually really capability, right? So the practical difference is, presumably, right, in general, a child who is old enough to sit on their father's shoulder is going to be younger than that same child who will be old enough to walk holding their father's hands, right? So the walking child is likely to be older. And Beit Hillel brings as a proof from the pasuk that these holidays are called regalim, which implies that they are holidays that are that part of the celebration, part of the obligation, is to walk to Har Habayit. So basically, according to Beit Hillel, as soon as the child is old enough to walk to Har Habayit, then they will be chayav. It comes back to what we were saying a moment ago. So it says a kol chayavim b'riyah, and let's skip everything else. It means everybody is obligated in the midst of riyah, let's say, except for a katan. And what is a katan? It's a child either this old or this old, and it's a child, according to Beit Shammai, who's old enough to sit on his father's shoulder. But presumably, if he's older than that, or if he's at least that old, then he has an obligation. So how could he have an obligation? He's still not gil mitzvot. So really the obligation is on the parent to educate them. That's part of the sugya here. So this is something that we'll look into another time, maybe a little bit more, but I'm just giving to you as this is another important source for this question of Gil Chinuch. So but the mitzvah, again, the mitzvah of Chinuch is an idea that that's an obligation of the parent, right? And that's from a difference, right? The Mishnah in Kiddushin talks about this. And we'll look at it separately. But in our case, now that we've seen that, by the way, so Hatinokot, we might even say something about the use of the word tinokot instead of katan. What would we think? So tinok we usually think of as an infant, even though that's not necessarily true. We have the phrase tinokot shel beit rabban, the children who are learning in their master's house or their master's yeshiva, basically they're cheder children. Kids who are learning in cheder are called tinokot shel beit rabban. And we know that they're not infants because they're old enough already to read. And there are many examples of that. So the word tinok is lav dafka, an infant, but it does seem to imply a very young child. Even though technically maybe one is a tinok all the way up until the time they're gil mitzvot. There are other gradations in terms of age and for different purposes, right? So we have also the idea of the na'ar and the boger, or the na'ara and the bogeret. I'm sure I see Michael Schwartz, I see you nodding your head because you've learned that, right? In different Mishnayot and Ketubot and other places, that there's a difference between, let's say, a girl who's 12 years in a day and a girl who's 12 years, 6 months in a day, right? And the 6 months that adds on makes her a bogeret. That has implications for various halachot. So the precise age is important. So here, I mean, I added in, but presumably we're talking about tinokot. The main point that we're making is we're talking about someone who is not yet obligated of themselves to do these mitzvot. And so the phrasing which they are, as it were, being acted upon, where somebody's afflicting them, would then presumably fall to the parent, and this seems to be borne out by the line that says about mechanchin, because it's the obligation of the parent to educate the child. And why do we educate them? So that they will be accustomed to mitzvot. You don't raise a child completely devoid of mitzvot, and then all of a sudden you spring on them when they're 13 years old in a day or 12 years old in a day, and say, now you have to do all this stuff, right? You bring them up in such an environment that they become accustomed to doing mitzvot. So it's still not exactly clear here what the chinuch is. And then, of course, there's another question. Whatever that means, why does it say lifnei shana v'lifnei shnatayim? In other words, if you're going to do it 2 years before, then obviously you're going to do it 1 year before. So what is it? What do we get out of the line lifnei shana v'lifnei shnatayim?
That one educates them progressively or in stages.
So what would be? So that's a possibility. What would that look like? What do you mean in stages?
One introduces certain things 2 years before and other things a year before, or sort of one starts more easily and then becomes more rigorous, or any number of different.
Okay, that's a perfectly reasonable shot. Let's look at the Bartanura now in this Mishnah. See what he says. So he says, "Ein ma'aninotam, ein chayavim linoa mehen ma'achal." Right. So we are not obligated to prevent them or to keep them from having food. So how does he understand ma'anin?
It means that we keep them from having food.
Yeah. So in other words, again, because we talked about this a little bit from the first Mishnah, the Torah says, "V'initem et nafshotechem." You should afflict your souls. And actually, Gemara learns out that it's b'sheva al ta'aseh. It's in a passive way. You're not supposed to actively, whip yourself or in some active way afflict yourself. Gemara actually talks about that, because that's what it sounds like. You need them sounds like you should be it's a transitive verb. You should be doing something actively to afflict yourselves. But Chazal warn out that that's not the intent. The intent is that you restrain yourself or you refrain from eating and drinking and the list of other things that we mentioned. And that's the inui. So when it's when the Mishnah is borrowing on that terminology. It says, Ein ma'aninotam. Well, we are not ma'aneh ourselves in an active way. So what does it mean when we're ma'aneh ourselves? When we're ma'aneh ourselves, it means that we don't eat and we don't drink. So the Bartanura is explaining that's also essentially what it means when we're talking about the parent toward the child. We are not obligated to prevent them from having food. We're not obligated to make them fast. But v'chanchinotan, so Bartanura says the sha'ot, which is what Michael Schwartz had said, v'chanchinotan by hours. If he was accustomed to eating at 4 hours, and it's 4 hours of the day, we feed him at the 5th or the 6th hour, according to the strength of the child. So the chanchinotan is the feed. He says explicitly means lefi sha'ot. Mifnei shana v'lifnei shnatayim. In the gears of the Bartanur, it's a little different. Kodem l'shana, which is essentially the same as late lifnei shana. Kodem l'shana, shana achat kodem l'firko. 1 year prior to his Perikir would be like coming of age. So if the child is sick, or let's say sickly, and weak in strength and cannot withstand, meaning we don't start this chinuch, the sha'ot, more than a year before if it's a sickly child. If we know that the child can't handle even a small deviation in their eating schedule. V'kodem l'shtayim, and before 2, meaning before 2 years, oshtei shanim kodem pirko ima tinok bari, or 2 years prior if it's a healthy child. Upirkan havi. So the Bartanur's pshat, which is the Gemara's pshat, it's not precisely what Michael Werner said. Although, like I said, Michael Werner's reading, it was a completely legitimate reading. We get it in another way. But the lifnei shana v'lifnei shnatayim, according to the Gemara, lifnei shana means we start the chinuch a year before if it's not such a healthy child, and 2 years before if it's a healthy child, if the child can handle it. So that's the shana v'shnatayim. And what does it mean kodem pirko, before their coming of age? Pirkan havi hatinoket bat 12 shana b'yom echad shein darka lahavi simanim ad zman zeh. So for a girl, her perek, her coming of age, her time where she becomes of age, is when she is 12 years and a day, because it is not her way to bring signs until that time. Signs here refers to, does anybody know? What are the signs we're looking for?
Specific signs of puberty.
Yeah, so specifically, if she has 2 pubic hairs. Once the child has 2 pubic hairs, then so technically, in order for anyone to become chayav b'mitzvot, you need two things. You need the age and you need a sign of puberty, and the sign is you have to have brought at least you have to show at least two pubic hairs. So this is a carefully worded statement here by the Bartanura. He says that with the girl, it's when she's 12 years in a day, because it is not her way to bring simanim, to have this, the sign of the pubic hair, until that time. Va'az bat onshin. And then she is a daughter of, literally a daughter of punishment. So that at that, from that time on, she can be punished by Torah law. Ufirko shel tinok habi ben shalosh shana v'yom echad, v'kodem zeh eino bar onshin. Right, so, and for a boy, it's 13 years in a day, and before that, he is not somebody who's obligated to punishment. So, these are all things that I hope to get into a little bit more. Again, this idea of these categories that apply to all of us, right? Any normal person, you go through different things in order to become obligated in mitzvot. And the idea that we look at the 12 years in a day and the 13 years in a day as kind of an absolute, it's not truly an absolute, because you also have to have simanim. But the assumption is, from that time, by that time, you will already have simanim. That's the assumption. In rare cases where the child has not brought simanim, that runs into separate categories, and we're not going to get into that. But that's the basic underlying assumption. So, to summarize, hatinokot are children who have not yet reached bar and bat mitzvah age, what we call bar and bat mitzvah age, or what the Bartanuri is referring to as bar onshin age. They haven't come to the age where they can be punished for not doing mitzvot or for being over on mitzvot. Ein ma'aninotam b'yom kippurim. Now we understand what that means is we don't prevent them from eating on Yom Kippur, but we're mechanchin lifnei shana v'lifnei shnatayim. We educate them regarding eating, meaning we start to change the times that they'll eat. We make them wait longer before they'll start to eat, beginning a year or two before they become bar onshin, depending on the health of the child. And that's all in order that they should be regil b'mitzvah. I think it's just also interesting, worth pointing out, that of all of the halachot and mitzvot, this is one of the only places where the Mishnah goes out of its way to tell us explicitly that there's an issue of chinuch, because in principle there's an issue of chinuch with all mitzvot, right? And like we said, the Mishnah in many places will talk about Kriyat Shema or Tefillah or any number of mitzvot, and will say that Ktanim are patur. Why doesn't it say there that they're patur of a mechanchin? Right? So we'll learn out the chinuch in different ways, but it seems to be pointing to something particularly important and foundational about Yom Kippur, that we introduce the idea of chinuch, and also because the idea of chinuch here is it's not as straightforward. Let's say if we're talking about chinuch of Kriyat Shema, which is one of the very first things you're supposed to teach a child, and learn that out also from Chagiga. But you can do that when the child is very young, but moreover, you can teach the child the entire Kriyat Shema when they're still very young. but there's a recognition about fasting that that's not something that you push on a child. So the idea of mechanchinotam lifnei shanav lifnei shnatayim is a recognition that even though we do want to be mechanechotam, we don't necessarily want to push them to be fasting in the same way as an adult is until they have to. So that seems to be part of what's implied here, and maybe also why chinuch is being singled out in this regard, because it's not the same chinuch as in other mitzvot where you can just teach them how to do the mitzvah. The way you teach somebody how to fast is by making them fast, by keeping them from having food. And that's not something we make you do to your child ad kidei kach.
Quick question. I would wonder if how seriously should we take the shorish of tinok, the yonek? I mean, in some sense, this implies a kind of relationship of feeding, and that in some sense, what's happening here is in fact a kind of weaning.
A kind of weaning. Well, then we.
I mean, of a kind. I mean, think about the shorish of tinok, which I mean, I'm just thinking, tinok is used instead of katan, which would maybe, if we're going to be very literal minded about this would imply that okay, it's at least metaphorically a kind of suckling relationship. And so,
I think that's an interesting observation, and it may be true. No, I understand what you're saying. Tinok refers to the suckling child, right, from yonek. And here we're talking about eating generally, right, or eating or not eating. So it could be right. Maybe that's the reason they chose the word. I don't know, but I think that's a good observation. It's certainly poetic, and whether it has, and maybe that's the only reason. In other words, it's literarily fine. I'm not sure if it implies anything more than that, but I think that's a good observation. Let's move on. So next Mishnah, Ubra Shehiricha. Ubra, a pregnant woman, a woman who's uberent. Ubra Shehiricha, that she smelled something. Ma'achilin ota ad shetashiv nafsha. We feed her until we put her soul at ease. Cholem ma'achilin ota al pi v'ki. A sick person, we feed him according to experts. And if there are no experts there, we feed him according to himself until he says enough. Okay, so Ubra Shehericha, a woman who's pregnant, who smells, who senses through her smell. What is she smelling?
Food.
Presumably she's smelling food. And so we feed her until her soul is put at rest, until she has some kind of satisfaction. What does that imply here? Like, what does that mean in context? Until we'll feed her until when?
Who is the Ubara? It's obviously not the fetus.
No. I said it's the pregnant woman. It's the Isha Me'uberet. The Ubra is the woman who is pregnant.
המעוברת, you would say today.
Yes, this is right. Hame'uberet. And so in Mishnah Kibbutz they say Ubra. Ubra Shehiricha. Right? So how much are we feeding her? So hold on to that question for a moment. So we have the Mishnah is talking about two categories of people. We have the Isha Me'uberet, we have the pregnant woman, and we have a sick person. They're not the same, right? The Mishnah treats them differently. Otherwise, it would just, if we thought that the Isha Me'uberet was the sick person, then we would just talk about sick people, right? So, first of all, Mishnah here is introducing altogether a new idea. Until now, what we know is that you're not allowed to eat and drink on Yom Kippur, right? That's the first Mishnah. And then a little later, it tells us that if you do eat or drink, that you're chayav, there's an Isur Torah. But now we're introducing another possibility, which is maybe under certain circumstances, you will be allowed to eat normally, right? In the beginning, so we went through these different phases in the Mishnah. Mishnah starts off with, I'm going to focus here just on the eating and drinking, that it's asur to eat and drink, and it's asur to do these other things, to wash yourself, anoint yourself, and so forth. And then the Mishnah gave exceptions to some of those things, not the eating and drinking, but to the rechitza and the ilata sandal, there are exceptions. Then we talked about the shiur of eating and drinking, and that if you eat or drink more, that shiur or more, then you're chayav. And we talked a little bit more about that, about halal machad and so forth, and that afila and shtia are not mitzarfin. And then just now we talked about the idea of the tinokot. So the tinokot introduces this idea, which is something that we need to express, which of course somebody who's not obligated to mitzvot doesn't have to fast. But we have also introduced in Mishnah Gimel and Mishnah Talmud this idea that we as parents have an obligation to educate them. And so we're going to start to restrict how much they eat when they're a little bit younger. And now the Mishnah is introducing something else that we haven't said explicitly, which is that there are people who are allowed to eat on Yom Kippur. So we have the Mu'beret and we have the Choleh, but they're not the same. So the Isha Mu'beret is Shehiricha. What does that imply? That so like you said, implies that she smelled food, and then what? Then what happened? She smelled food, and then what happened?
She would have a strong craving. I wonder if they believe that craving would lead to an early birth, a miscarriage.
So possibly, but the main thing is that let's say it's going to the implication is going to be something like you're saying. In other words, it's not a whim. It's not a whim. It's not on a whim that she gets a craving, and it's not on a whim that we're going to let her eat, or I should say better, ma'achilin. We feed her. We actively feed her. So it implies that the Ubra Shehericha may be in some kind of danger, if not for herself, but maybe for the Ubar, for the fetus.
Maybe she's in some sort of danger, and that's why it's also the next bit talks about the Chola who is in danger.
Very good. Right? So it leads into the idea of the Choleh. So the Choleh, so first of all, if we take this pshat that Hiricha means that she smelled food and it gave her a craving, or let's say, maybe just take it to that step that if the ubra has a craving, we actively feed her. And how much do we feed her? It doesn't give a shiur per se. It doesn't say kikotevet hagasan. It doesn't say kazait. It doesn't tell us a shiur. It just says ad shetashiv nafsha, until her soul is at rest, right? Is at ease. So that's obviously going to be a kind of a relative measure. It's going to depend on her. So she's going to be the one that will determine how much she eats. A choleh, we feed him according to experts. So what does that mean? Who are the experts?
Presumably doctors.
Presumably doctors, people who would be, and what are we afraid of with the choleh that he doesn't eat?
He will, I mean, ultimately he will die.
Right, but of course, ultimately all of us will die.
He
So
will die.
I'm pulling your leg a little bit, but the reason I'm doing it is it raises a question, right? It doesn't tell us what kind of choleh this is. When we talk about a pregnant woman, so it's a certain category, right? We know that a pregnant woman is in a certain kind of physical state, and like Michael Schwartz said, so maybe we're worried about miscarriage or something that might adversely affect the pregnancy or the pregnant woman. When we talk about a choleh, it's not clear here. What exactly does that mean? So maybe it's a kind of choleh. To take Michael Werner's example, let's say it's a kind of choleh that if they don't eat now, there's an imminent chance of death. That they may be deathly ill if they don't eat. And the other possibility is not that, right? That it's a person who's sick, and if they don't eat now, they won't die, but maybe their situation will worsen. Maybe there will be other adverse long-term effects, even short of death. So, as you probably know, in halacha, there is this distinction between the choleh sheyesh bo sakana, the choleh she'ein bo sakana. So, but right now, the Mishnah has not yet given us a clear distinction. So when it says choleh ma'achilina al pi b'kiyin, so it's right away telling us there's a difference between the choleh and the ubra, right? So the ubra, when do we start feeding the ubra?
When she has this craving.
When she has a craving. When do we start feeding the choleh?
Basically, either when the doctors say so, or if there aren't doctors, then when the sick person.
Okay, so right, exactly. So the first tier is we ask experts if this person needs to eat. But what if there's no expert to ask? Then we'll depend on the person himself or herself to tell us. Till he says enough. So again, there's not a shiur. It's but now we seem to have two criteria for how much somebody who is allowed to eat on Yom Kippur is allowed to eat. If you're a pregnant woman, then we're going to feed you until tashiv nafshech, until your soul is put at ease. If you're a sick person, then we'll feed you until you say enough. But let's examine these last couple of lines here a little bit more closely. Cholem achilin oto al pi bikiyin, v'im sham bikiyin achilin oto al pi atzmo. And when it says ad shiomar dai, until he says enough, what does that refer to? Ad shiomar dai. What is that? What sentence or sentences is that a continuation of?
So it's basically a sense of continuation of when the sick person is saying that he needs to eat and there's no doctor because there's no doctor available.
Okay, so it's definitely going to be that one, right? Could it possibly also be the end of the first sentence? In other words, ad shiomar dai might refer to both sections. So not necessarily clear, except to say, we might say that in the case of machilinot al pi v'kiyin, might be more appropriate to say until they say enough, right? Because if we're consulting experts just to feed them the chatchila, we're going to consult an expert before we put anything in their mouth, then presumably it's going to be up to them. So, but in either case, apparently we're not worried about ad shetashiv nafsho. We don't necessarily have to feed them until they feel at ease. We feed them until they say enough, either until the bikin say enough or until he says enough. So that's a difference between the ubra and the choleh. So which do you think means, which one do you think, I'll put it this way. What do you think the difference is between ad shetashiv nafsha and ad shiomar dai? What do you think that difference might be?
One won't be until her distress is eased, and the other one until he says, okay, I'm out of danger.
And in practical terms, what's the difference in terms of how much they'll eat?
In both cases, it's actually subjective.
In both cases, it's going to be subjective. Again,
so we don't know which one necessarily be more food or less food because it's completely subjective.
Okay, so that, yes, and then now I want you to think about it this way. Let's say if you think about it just in terms of yourself, what do you think the difference would be between saying, right, tashiv nafshi or ani omer dai? What do you think that might be relative to one person?
In the case of the pregnant woman, she decides that it's enough. In case of the sick person, you decide when he has got enough strength to stop eating.
Michael Werner, you shook your head.
Well, in some, it sounds like, Adshe Yomar diet sounds like the sick person himself speaking. So in both cases, the ball is in the court of the person being fed to say, just to set a limit.
Right. So So this is just a point that we have to make, that in the case of the pregnant woman, we don't even ask her if she wants to eat or doesn't want to eat. If she has a craving, then we're going to feed her. In the case of the sick person, then then we have two possibilities. If there's bikiyin there, then machinot al pi bikiyin. But if there are no bikiyin there, then it's up to him. And then if he says that he needs to eat, then we do feed him, and he will eat until he says enough. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is, I would tend to say Achita Shiv Nafsha is a higher threshold than die. That is, the person who says enough means is going to be aware, they're aware of the fact that they're supposed to be fasting today, right? All of these people know they're supposed to be fasting. So the person who said, the cholah who says die, like on the one hand, they're saying, I need to eat, and I feel in myself that I will be in some kind of bodily danger if I don't eat. And then, so we let them eat ad shiomar dai until they say enough. So that enough would be enough to keep them from being in danger. With the ubra, it's a different K'nei midah, it's a different type of measure. It's until she feels okay. So again, it's not like you just said a moment ago. It doesn't give us specific amounts because they're going to be relative to each person and each situation. But there's a certain theme now that we have here in Yoma that we already had from the shiurim, right? So the shiur of achidah for which you're over is kechotevet hagasa, right? Kamota garinata, right? Like the size of the whole date, including the size of the pit that's inside it. And the amount of drinking is malolugma, the same, like a cheekful. And we already pointed out those are not normal measures. We don't necessarily use those for measuring amounts of food and drink in other places. And the reason we use them here is because why? Why did we say we use those measures on Yom Kippur?
These are measures that are readily at hand.
Yeah, but that's not what we said why we use them on Yom Kippur.
Because in the Mishnah doesn't talk about not eating, it talks about afflicting oneself. So there's not that distinction.
Okay, so yeah, so along these lines, right? So just to remind you, the Bartanura said Kikotevet is a fat date. It's less than a kibetza. And he says, Afal gav the kol shiurei achila pikazayit. Even though all of the shiurim that we use when we're measuring eating, we measure with the kazayit. Hainim shum dichtiv b'hu achila. That's because in other instances, the Torah tells us to eat of a hachad d'oktiv ela asher lo ti'uneh. Here it says, anyone who does not afflict themselves. Gemiri, the vatzir mikotzevet lo miyatza da'ate v'havi mu'uneh. Less than somebody who eats less than a kotzevet, their mind is not at ease, and they are afflicted. So the shiur is different on Yom Kippur, even though a kazayit is much less than a kotzevet hagasa. We said we talked about this last time we met. So it was 2 weeks ago. But the norm for eating, the norm for shiur of achila, it's not based on whether or not I'm going to feel afflicted if I don't eat. It's based on an idea that you have to eat a certain minimal amount of food in order to have eaten something. Right? So let's say to eat a kazayit of, the Torah tells us you have to eat korban pesach. So if you just put a teeny bit in your mouth, technically you ate something, but we wouldn't call that achila. It's not a shiur of actual eating. It's not something that a person would sit down and say, I've really eaten something. So that shiur is determined to be a kazayit. Here, we're not talking about a person sitting down to a meal of some sort. We're talking about the idea that you're supposed to afflict yourself. So if you eat less than the amount that it would take to be afflicted, you haven't been over, right? You haven't transgressed what the Torah is talking about. So this terminology of Ad Tashiv Nafsha, we saw this essentially earlier in the Bartanura. It says that eating less than a shiur on Yom Kippur is not enough to be miyashev nefesh, or he says like to be miyashev da'at. Similar idea. Okay, so okay. So what was I trying to say? I was just pointing out that that along the same lines that we mentioned earlier, that we have the shiur of Kotevet Hagasam, we have the shiur of Melolu Gmav. So those shiurim are shiurim on Yom Kippur because of this concept of inui nefesh. That's why they're pertinent to Yom Kippur. And so in a similar vein, when I'm trying to determine who may or may not eat, or who do we have to feed, right? Ma'achilin. Who are we obliged to feed on Yom Kippur, and how much? It's going to also be related to this idea as well. Now, we'll get a little more into it. It's a little more intricate, but I'm just pointing out that these are concepts that are particularly pertinent to Yom Kippur. So let's look at the Bartanura here. Ubra Shehiricha. The Bartanura says, Ubra Shehiricha, Ha'ubar Meiriach Reach Atavshil, Vihi Mit'ava Lo. This is how they understand the terminology of Ubra. The Ubra, what is it? Why do we call the pregnant woman Ubra in this instance? Because it's the fetus that is smelling the aroma of something cooking. The mother, mitavalo. And then the mother has a craving on behalf of the fetus. I see Michael Schwartz smiling. It's a great concept, right?
Yes, it's strange, but yes.
Well, I don't know. Ask a pregnant woman.
Yes, she's being driven by something else, not herself, I guess.
That one of the problems that we as men have when we're learning things like this is we can only understand them in some theoretical plane. But talk to a pregnant woman, that for them this is experiential, right? This is really experiential, and they know what the Mishnah means. We might also have cravings, but you don't have. None of us has ever had the cravings of a pregnant woman.
So it's the old, it's the old cliche. I'm eating for two.
Yeah, and that and Joan Rivers said, I never understood that. Who are these two people, and why can't they eat for themselves? That was her line. Paul, did you want to say something?
Why don't we have a woman in the Chavurah?
Because the only one we had, the only we had some over time, but they
why did they leave? We need them.
Unfortunately, they're not here with us today. A couple of them still follow using the videos, but maybe I can get them to comment for next time. I know plenty of women who have been pregnant in the past.
So if they are listening to the video, so please come back.
Right. Now you need us. Now. Anyway, but let's finish the Barton. If she doesn't eat, then they are both in danger. Both the mother and the child are in danger. So it doesn't say to what degree the danger is. And again, this is an area that will need to go into greater depth. which we're not going to do for a while, but things that we need to come back to. Right? Choleh machilin oto al pi v'kiyim. So the choleh, we feed him according to experts, and Bartzuna says, Rofim mumchin be'umdantan. Right? So they're talking about doctors who are expert in their field, in this field of expertise. If there are no experts, then we feed him according to himself. So this is how the Gemara explains our Mishnah. Bamedvarim amurim somchin al divrei biki. Right. So wait, before we get to the Bartzuna, just to remind us, in other words, so it sounds like there's only two ways that you could feed a choleh. Either with bikiyin, so if there are bikiyin there who say that he needs to eat, then we'll feed him. If they're not bikiyin there, we can still feed him according to his own discretion, according to his own decision. The Gemara understands this a little bit differently. When do we rely on the words of experts? When do we rely on experts? We rely on experts when the sick person themselves says, I don't need, or they're silent. That is, the implication is we see this person is sick. We, the observers, see the person is sick. And we say to them, you should eat. And they say, I don't need to eat, or they don't reply, they don't respond. But if they say that they need, or they personally say, I need to eat, Ein sham bikiyin klal, then there are no experts there at all. Meaning, klomar, ein bikiyutan chashuva lichlum. Then their expertise is not at all important. Rather, we feed him according to what he says. The af al pisha bikiyin omrim einot sari. Even though the experts say he doesn't need. Right, so given the way the Mishnah reads straight, it sounds like as long as there are experts there, they call all of the shots. So if there are experts there and the bikiyin say he doesn't need to eat, then we wouldn't feed him because the experts say he doesn't need to eat. It's only if there are no experts there that we will feed him according to what he says. So the Gemara says, no, that's not how you understand the Mishnah. And I think this is a sugya that we'll come back to and see in greater depth. Then according to the Gemara says, no, that the bikiyin they're only important in a case where the choleh says they don't need to eat, or they don't actively say that they need to eat. Either they're shiltek or they say no tzarich. So if the choleh says I don't need to eat, but expert doctors say no, that choleh must eat, we don't listen to the choleh, we listen to the doctors. And by the same token, if the doctors say this choleh doesn't need to eat, but the choleh says I do need to eat, we listen to the choleh. So we're mekil on both sides. We're mekil on both sides. So the only purpose of having the doctor is the doctor isn't there to tell somebody not to eat. That's what comes out of this. The bikiyin can only be there with kula. The bikiyin can only be there to say that a choleh must eat when the choleh is either not responding or saying they don't need to. So that's different than what we would have understood from the straight Mishnah. This is a very important point, right? You consult a doctor on Yom Kippur if you need to eat. If you don't think you need to eat, but other people do, and they bring a doctor, the doctor examines you, and the doctor says, or they know your medical history, whatever is going to be relevant. They say, no, you have to eat. Then you listen to the doctor and you eat. And if the doctor says you don't need to eat, but you feel strongly that you're going to be extremely ill if you don't eat, then you listen to yourself and you eat. And you don't listen to the doctor. Right? These are not things we're fooling around with. So it's a very interesting thing, which of course we all take this for granted. That on Yom Kippur you eat if there's some kind of medical danger. But I think we should all consider and appreciate that the lo muvan me'elav. It's not something we should take for granted. Chazal could have understood the Torah differently. Could have understood the Torah to mean that there are no exceptions, and if you die, you die. Right? It's not the only place that we have it. The drasha, the famous drasha is v'chai bahem, that you should live with them, live by the Torah mitzvot and not die by them. But that's a drasha. That's not the plain shot of the Torah. But it's teaching us something very, very important. That even in places where the Torah seems to not care for our personal welfare, or to put it differently, we could have conceived of a theology that would tell us that you do mitzvot willy-nilly, you do them ba'al korchach. Whether you live or die, you have to. What's supreme is doing mitzvot. But this is one of the places that we see that there are other. You have to bring into account other mitzvot, or you have to bring into account that maybe that right now you have to be mevatel this mitzvah in order that you can be mekayem many mitzvot in the future. Right? There's a theological expression here which we're touching on. So I just want to point that out. So I think we're basically at the end. What I'm going to do now in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to read the next two Mishnayot. I'll encourage you all to go over what we've done and maybe look ahead. But we'll examine these Mishnayot in greater depth next time. And then next time, I think we'll be able to finish till the end of the parak, and then we're going to go back and start to do some selected sugyot that I keep threatening to do. So Mishnah Vav talks about Mishachazot Bulmus, somebody who is overtaken by a bulmus, which apparently is croup or something like croup, right? But you're overcome by a sickness. It's called bulmus. We feed him even unclean things, even things that are tameh, that is not kosher, until his eyes light, till the light comes back to his eyes. Someone who was bitten by a mad dog. We don't feed him from the liver of the dog that bit him. Rabbi Mati ben Charash Matir. Rabbi Mati ben Charash permits that. Odamar Rabbi Mati ben Charash. Rabbi Mati ben Charash also said, a choshesh bigrono, someone who has a feeling, in other words, some kind of a feeling of sickness in their throat. Matilin lo sam b'toch piv b'shabbat. We put a drug or an herb or a drug inside of their mouth on Shabbat. Because that's falls into the category of Spek Nefashot, a doubt about their lives, right? Literally their souls. The whole Spek Nefashot doche et Shabbat. Any doubt regarding life pushes away the Sabbath, pushes away Shabbat, right? And that's a concept that we touched on elsewhere. There's an idea of the Chiyat Shabbat, you push away Shabbat, in contrast to what we say on Pesach. If most of the tzibur is tamei on Pesach, then we say tumah hutra for Pesach. That is, if most of the tzibur is tamei, then it's permitted to bring the korban Pesach the tumah. There's a difference between hutra and nidcheh. Something that's pushed away, and something that's completely permitted. That's a concept that we'll also look into when we get there. And then this Mishnah, very famous Mishnah, Mishnafla Lav Mapole, someone upon whom fell a pile of rocks, pile of stones or rocks. Safek Kusham, Safek Enosham. We're in doubt whether he is there or not there. In other words, we don't know for sure. We see somebody walking next to a crumbling building, or maybe even walking into a crumbling building, and the building collapses. We're not sure if he actually is in the pile or not in the pile. Safek Chai, Safek Meit. We're not sure if he is alive or dead. Safek Nochri, Safek Yisrael. We're not sure if he's a Jew or a non-Jew. Mefakrin alav v'tagav. We uncover for him the pile. We reveal the pile. Mitza'uhu chai. If we find him alive, mefakrin alav. Then we uncover for him. The mate, yanichuvu. And if he's dead, we leave him. So this is the Mishnah that I think we may have mentioned another time, and this is the source for the term of pikuach nefesh. The fakeach means to reveal or to open up, right? Biblically, it's also in modern Hebrew, but biblically, you're mefakeach einayim, right? We say it also in the morning in the bracha, pokeach ivrim. God opens the eyes, reveals the eyes of the blind. So that's the verb. The fakeach is to open or reveal. And so here we have the case of the person the person may be in fact covered up by a rock pile. So mifakrin, we're going to reveal it. So the pikuach nefesh is that we're mifakrin et agal, the galot or the hatzil nefesh. We're uncovering the pile in the possibility of trying to save a life. So that's how we get the term pikuach nefesh. And I think that's it for today. Any last words? No. Okay.
Pikeach is a person who is not iver. Yes, ivrim upikrim.
Right. And
seeing person.
The seeing person is a pikech, or in a broader sense, someone who is aware, right, is a pikech. And since we're on the Pinat Lashon, it's also seems to be related to the word pikeach with a kaf, who's a sober person. Pikeach with a kaf is a sober person. Yeah. So we'll leave it at that. So listen, actually, I should say this now. We will not be meeting next week. Next week at this time, unless you hear from me otherwise. But the thing is, next week is the day that I'm supposed to show up for jury duty in the morning. So that would be, I have to show up, I think, at 8 o'clock in the morning. I don't know if they're going to dismiss me or not. So I have to say, I think it's going to be, I think let's just say we're not going to meet. As much as I would like to say, I could tell you at the last minute, but then, maybe you'll make other plans, and I don't want to get in the way of that.
As long as you're on camera, you have an audience, you need to practice rubbing your hands gleefully and saying, hang them all, hang them all.
Right. Well, what should I say when the judge informs me this is just about a traffic ticket? I'll still say hang them all. Okay. Have a good rest of your week and Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.
Night.
Bye-bye.